What if the greatest tragedy of the spiritual life is not that God is silent, but that we are too loud to hear him? What if his voice hasn't disappeared, but has simply been drowned beneath the hum of our habits? Those small daily choices that clutter the soul and close the ear. We long for clarity, for guidance, for intimacy with the divine. But rarely do we pause to ask, what have we allowed to stand in the way of hearing him clearly? The modern soul has grown uncomfortable with silence. It fidgets in the presence of stillness as though something vital were missing. We've become so accustomed to motion, to alerts and alarms, meetings and messages, that anything slower than a sprint feels like stagnation. And yet, while our schedules overflow, our spirits remain parched. We chase tasks like they are sacred, but forget that the sacred often waits patiently in the quiet corners we never visit. Busyness is not merely a condition of the calendar, it is a posture of the heart. One may be outwardly idle and inwardly racing. Another may move through a full day with a spirit of calm. What matters is not how much we do, but how much space we've left for what truly matters. The tragedy is not that we are busy, but that we are busy with the wrong things. Things that crowd out the stillness where God tends to speak. We confuse motion with meaning, and noise with necessity. The danger lies in this. We are deceived by the illusion that being busy is being faithful. We believe that constant involvement is a mark of purpose, that spiritual life is proven by spiritual activity. But even noble things can become noise. Even ministry can become a distraction. The man or woman who cannot sit still before God, who finds rest uncomfortable and silence unbearable, is not likely to hear the subtle movements of the divine. God does not compete with the clamor. He does not force his way into our overloaded schedules. He is not loud, but consistent. His voice a gentle current beneath the surface, waiting for the one who will slow down long enough to feel it. There is something scandalously ordinary about how God speaks, not through firestorms or fame, but through quiet nudges, through gentle scriptures, through conviction whispered in prayer. And that kind of hearing demands attention, not activity. In truth, we are often afraid of silence because we are afraid of what we might hear in it. If the phone is off and the room is still, what rises up in us? The echoes of guilt, the weight of regret, the haunting absence of joy? These are things the soul prefers to drown in productivity. We'd rather stay moving than be still enough to face ourselves. And yet, this avoidance is precisely what keeps us from God. For he does not only speak comfort, he speaks truth. He doesn't just soothe, he confronts. And we must be willing to hear both. The stillness required to hear God is not passive. It is a kind of inner discipline, a willed quietness. It means creating margin, protecting solitude, guarding Sabbath. Not just as traditions, but as sacred spaces where God is invited. It is a conscious turning down of the world's volume. We must be willing to let some messages go unread, some invitations unanswered, some tasks unfinished. Not out of laziness, but out of reverence. The soul was not designed to run endlessly. It was designed to wait, to watch, to respond. But if it is always reacting, always performing, always racing, it loses its sensitivity. We become spiritually tone-deaf, not because the divine has grown silent, but because we've forgotten how to listen. There is an ancient wisdom in the phrase, "Be still and know that I am God." Not be successful, not be admired, not be productive, but be still. In that stillness, the knowledge of God becomes more than a concept. It becomes an encounter. And until we make space for that stillness, His voice will remain muffled beneath the roar of our busyness. There is a subtle pride in the desire to control. It masquerades as responsibility, as wisdom, even as stewardship, but underneath it all lies fear. The fear that if we do not keep a tight grip, everything might fall apart. So we plan, we orchestrate, we strategize and calculate, telling ourselves it is faith in action, when very often it is simply faith in ourselves. The addiction to control is not loud or obvious. It weaves itself quietly into the routines of life, convincing us that the more we manage, the safer we will be. And yet, for all our managing, peace remains just out of reach. Control demands certainty. It insists on outcomes. It treats life like a chessboard where each move must secure the next. But life rarely obeys such logic, and God almost never does. His voice is not something we can schedule. His direction is not a memo to be delivered on demand. He leads by trust, not by explanation. He gives light for the next step, not the whole path. But those addicted to control grow restless with such mystery. They prefer maps over manna, forecasts over faith. The one who craves control lives in a constant state of tension. Their prayers are laced with conditions, their worship quietly weighted with demands. They want to hear from God, but only if He says what they were hoping to hear. They want direction, but only if it matches their plans. What they truly seek is not guidance, but confirmation. They do not want a lord, they want a consultant. Control is a form of self-protection. It arises from wounds unhealed and disappointments unresolved. Somewhere along the line, something broke, and the soul vowed, perhaps silently, never again. Never again would it feel helpless, never again caught off guard. And so it armored itself with control, believing that if enough boxes are checked, if enough variables are accounted for, vulnerability can be avoided. But God speaks most clearly to the vulnerable. He draws near to the contrite, not the calculating. He leads those willing to follow, not those demanding to drive. There is a kind of listening that only the surrendered heart can do. It does not come with terms or timelines. It simply waits. It asks not to manipulate, but to obey. The addicted heart cannot do this easily. It asks and waits with one hand still gripping the wheel. It says, "Your will be done," but quietly draws up a contingency plan just in case. It treats God like a partner, not a king. Letting go of control feels like falling, but it is, in truth, the beginning of flight. The hands that are open in surrender are finally free to receive. The mind that ceases its frantic grasping becomes quiet enough to discern the whispers of the Spirit. But as long as we are addicted to certainty, we will be deaf to the unpredictable beauty of grace. God does not owe us explanations. He offers something better, His presence. But presence cannot be possessed, only welcomed. And it is welcomed by the heart that says, in trembling honesty, "Even if I do not understand, I trust you." That is where true hearing begins, not in the moment of instruction, but in the moment of release. The voice of God is not given to the ones with the best plans, but to the ones who lay their plans down. It is not shouted to the anxious mind, but spoken softly to the heart at rest. If we would hear Him clearly, we must be willing to loosen our grip, to stop engineering our outcomes, to open our clenched fists and simply say, "Speak, Lord, I will listen. Even if I don't get to steer, There is a quiet heaviness that settles over a heart unwilling to forgive. It may not shout, it may not even speak, but it colors everything: our prayers, our relationships, even our ability to discern truth from emotion. Unforgiveness is not simply the refusal to release another. It is the slow construction of a prison in which we ourselves are the captive. We think we are guarding justice, holding someone accountable, preserving dignity or memory, but more often we are only building walls around our own clarity. The soul that clings to bitterness cannot hear clearly. God, who is love, speaks fluently the language of mercy, and where that language is rejected, his voice becomes hard to recognize. We may read the sacred texts, we may sing the right songs and recite the right prayers, but if our hearts are sealed off by resentment, the message becomes muffled. What we hear is filtered through injury, suspicion, and defense. Even the most beautiful truth can sound distorted when heard through the ears of the embittered. Forgiveness is not about denying the wound. It is not about forgetting, excusing, or minimizing what was done. It does not erase the past. What it does, rather, is release the wound from its position as master of the present. Forgiveness hands over the right to punish to the only one truly righteous to judge. It is not a decision to trust the offender, it is a decision to trust God. And that ultimately is why unforgiveness is so dangerous to the spiritual life. It places more faith in our own sense of justice than in His. The longer we nurture a grudge, the more it shapes us. We begin to carry offense like a shield, suspicious even of those who come in peace. We hear rebuke where there is none. We sense threat in correction. We confuse God's conviction with condemnation because our hearts are already predisposed to defend rather than receive. In this posture, the voice of God, though present and patient, becomes almost unintelligible. A hardened heart loses its ability to discern tenderness. What was meant to be a dialogue becomes a monologue, with our pain doing all the speaking. Forgiveness is not a feeling, nor is it a one-time act that permanently erases pain. It is often a repeated choice, made in the quiet places of the heart, sometimes daily, to release the grip of bitterness and invite healing in its place. That kind of choosing is not weakness. It is a strength most people never develop. The world calls it foolish, heaven calls it holy, and only those who walk that narrow path know the freedom it brings. We often think we are punishing others by withholding forgiveness, but more often than not, they have moved on while we remain stuck, rehearsing the injury, reanimating the offense, replaying the moment as though it might change. But it never changes, it only deepens its roots. And meanwhile, the voice of God, which calls us to freedom and wholeness, waits outside the walls we ourselves have built. He does not force his way in. He waits for the heart, willing to unlock the door, not just to let the offender go, but to let God in. The tender soul is the listening soul, and tenderness is impossible without release. Forgiveness softens the ears of the heart, makes us receptive again. It makes us available to wisdom, open to correction, ready for joy. The bitterness that once clouded our perception begins to lift, and in its place, clarity begins to return. Not just emotional clarity, but spiritual sensitivity. We hear better because we are no longer arguing with God about what is fair. We are simply letting Him be just, letting Him be God, and letting ourselves be free to hear. There is something deeply seductive about the idea that we are enough on our own. It begins as a quiet self-assurance, a sense of competence, a well-earned confidence in our ability to manage what life throws at us. But over time, if left unchecked, it grows into something far more dangerous. A belief that we do not need help, not from others, and certainly not from God. This is the essence of pride in self-sufficiency, not loud arrogance, but the subtle drift away from dependence. It is the soul's decision to rely on itself, to solve its own problems, to be its own guide. God resists the proud, not out of hostility, but because pride places the soul out of reach when we are full of our own wisdom, our own strength, our own understanding. There is no space left for his voice. We may still go through the motions of faith, church attendance, daily devotions, even generous acts of service, but underneath it all is a stubborn resistance to being led. Pride does not kneel easily. It does not ask for directions. It does not confess its limitations. A self-sufficient soul is often very capable. It gets things done. It earns applause. It appears put together, organized and strong, and that is precisely why it is so hard to reach. Need is the soil where revelation grows. Desperation opens the ears to hear. But when we believe we already know the way, already have the answers, already understand what is best, we stop listening. Not because God has stopped speaking, but because we have no reason to listen. There is a certain kind of blindness that comes with pride. We see what we want to see. We interpret divine silence as approval because we're not really waiting for an answer. We've already made our decision. We move forward with our plans and ask God to bless them rather than submitting them for his guidance. We treat prayer as a formality rather than a necessity. And when things unravel, we call it mystery, when in truth, it is often the result of a heart too proud to pour. Humility is not self-hatred, nor is it weakness. It is the honest recognition of need. It is knowing that we are not the source, that we are not the center, that we are not designed to carry the weight of our own existence alone. The humble heart listens quickly and often. It does not wait for crisis to seek counsel. It does not measure worth by independence. It sees dependence not as a flaw, but as a posture of wisdom. And it is in this posture that the voice of God becomes unmistakably clear. Self-sufficiency makes demands. Humility makes room. One insists on answers, the other waits for them. One is closed off in confidence, the other is open in wonder. The prideful heart may still speak of God, still claim belief, still quote verses and sing songs, but it does not listen. It consults God the way a boardroom consults a figurehead, politely, infrequently, and without genuine intent to obey. God does not force his way into the heart that believes it can do life alone. He does not shout over our self-assurance. He simply waits, as all true love does, for the moment when the soul realizes it is not enough. And in that moment, when the illusion of self-sufficiency breaks and we finally say, "I cannot do this without you," the voice we thought was silent becomes unmistakable, not because it was never there, but because we are finally quiet enough to listen. The soul, like the body, is shaped by what it consumes. And in a world built on the economy of attention, distraction has become the dominant diet. We do not merely encounter distractions, we feed on them. We invite them, we reach for them, we depend on them to fill the empty spaces of silence and thought. Screens glow from the moment we rise, voices pour through headphones, images flicker endlessly. And when there is even the faintest lull in activity, our fingers reach instinctively for more. We are not comfortable being still because we are no longer practiced in being present. Distraction is not always obvious. It is not only the loud and the obscene. It can be the trivial, the pleasant, even the informative. It can wear the face of productivity. The danger is not merely in what we are doing, but in what we are neglecting while we do it. We may not be running from God with rebellion, but we are drifting from Him with noise. Not out of hatred, but out of habit. And all the while, the quiet, constant voice of the Spirit grows harder to recognize. Not because it has faded, but because we have tuned it out beneath layers of interruption. There is something deeply spiritual about attention. What we give our attention to is what we become sensitive to. If we fixate on fear, we grow anxious. If we feed on outrage, we become angry. If we constantly entertain ourselves, we grow numb. And if we never linger in the quiet where God speaks, we begin to forget what His voice sounds like. We become spiritually disoriented, not because God is silent, but because we have filled the sanctuary of our minds with echoes of other things. The soul is not built to multitask in the way we force it to. We flick between thoughts, faces, opinions, and stories with speed, but without depth. In doing so, we form a kind of spiritual shallowness, an inability to dwell long enough in anything sacred. We skim the surface of Scripture. We rush through prayer. We demand inspiration in bite-sized portions and leave no space for holy interruption. Distraction trains us to expect God to speak in the same brief, flashy manner the world does. But God rarely conforms to such patterns. He speaks in quiet ways, over time, to the attentive heart. When distraction becomes a way of life, discernment begins to wither. We lose the ability to know what is weighty and what is noise. We become reactive instead of reflective. We fill every pause with content, every moment of waiting with movement. And soon, our inner life is cluttered with fragments. There is no room for wonder, no room for the slow unfolding of revelation. And without wonder, the voice of God is easily mistaken for mere thought. To hear clearly, we must reclaim stillness, not just external silence, but an internal quiet, a turning down of the world's volume. This does not mean rejecting every form of media or abandoning technology, but it does mean reordering our appetites. We must learn again to crave the eternal over the immediate, the deep over the endless scroll of surface. Attention is a kind of worship. Whatever we look at longest shapes what we love most. If we cannot give God our attention, we cannot truly give Him our affection. Distraction numbs us, not just to God, but to ourselves. It keeps us from facing the deep questions, the unhealed wounds, the quiet callings. It shields us from boredom, but also from awe. To hear the voice of God is not merely to pause from time to time. It is to cultivate a life with space. Space for mystery, space for presence, space to notice when He speaks. And He always speaks, just not always over the noise we've come to call normal. The human tongue is a restless thing. It rushes to fill silence, to defend, to declare, to explain, to justify. We are quick to speak and slow to listen, though wisdom would teach the opposite. In our conversations with others and with God, we often use words not to connect, but to control. We speak to be heard, to be understood, to be right, but rarely do we pause long enough to receive. And in the spiritual life, this imbalance is especially costly. For it is the listening heart that discerns the whisper of God. There is a kind of noise that does not come from the outside. It rises from within, the endless commentary of our own voice. Even in prayer, we do not always seek communion. Sometimes we only seek relief. Our prayers can become monologues, lists of needs, streams of complaints, moments of venting, masked as devotion. We speak, and when we are done, we rise and go, assuming the exchange is complete. But prayer is not a performance. It is not a speech. It is a relationship, and relationships require listening. Listening is not passive, it is an act of surrender. To listen is to acknowledge that there is something worth hearing that did not originate with us. It is the humility to say, "Your thoughts are higher than mine," and to wait in reverent silence for what he might reveal. But this kind of silence is foreign to us. We are a people trained to fill the void, to respond instantly, to offer opinion and reaction. Stillness makes us feel exposed. Yet it is only in that vulnerable stillness that God's voice can truly land. When we speak more than we listen, we assume a posture of self-authority. We put ourselves at the center of the exchange. Our words dominate, and we miss the quiet, patient truth that God never forces his way into a conversation. He does not shout over us. He waits to be invited. And if the air is always filled with our declarations, our interpretations, our conclusions, there is little space left for the divine response. There is wisdom in the slow tongue. There is strength in restraint. Those who speak sparingly often speak with depth, because they have first heard deeply. The soul that listens more than it speaks becomes attuned to nuance, to layers of meaning, to the subtle prompting of the spirit. Such a soul is not rushed. It is not anxious to prove anything. It is not desperate to be noticed or affirmed. It simply waits, and in that waiting, it becomes wise. The habit of overspeaking flows from a deep need to be understood, to be in control, to make sense of the world on our own terms. But the invitation of God is not to figure everything out through articulation. It is to lean not on our own understanding. Sometimes clarity does not come by speaking, but by receiving. Sometimes the word we need is not found in the many things we say, but in the one thing he whispers when we finally go quiet. Even in our spiritual communities, we often reward the articulate. We look to those who speak fluently of God, who explain mysteries with ease. But the deepest wisdom is often found in those who speak little and listen much, who have trained their inner ear not just for truth, but for the tone of the one who is truth. Hearing God is not about mastering language, but about surrendering to presence. And presence cannot be known while we are still narrating, still insisting, still talking. The voice of God waits for the one who will listen, not for a moment, but as a way of life. So then, if the voice of God seems faint, distant, or clouded, perhaps it is not because he is silent, but because our lives are too full of other sounds. These 6 habits, busyness, control, unforgiveness, self-sufficiency, distraction, and overspeaking, are not merely flaws of character, they are barriers of the soul. They dull the senses and clutter the space where divine presence longs to dwell. And though they may feel familiar, even necessary, they are not benign. They are the quiet architects of distance between us and the voice we were made to hear. To hear God clearly is not about perfect theology, spectacular moments, or spiritual performance. It is about cultivating a posture, a life emptied of noise and clutter, willing to be still, willing to be small. It is about becoming quiet enough, humble enough, surrendered enough to recognize the whisper that has been calling all along. For God is not hiding, he is not reluctant, he is not far off. He is near, nearer than breath, always speaking. But only the uncluttered heart will know how to listen. Let that be our pursuit, not merely to speak of him, not merely to work for him, but to hear him clearly, truly, and without interruption.